Okay, recording on. So I'm Heather Kraus, and I am a mathematical statistician and the founder of a project called We All Count. And the purpose of We All Count is very specific. It is to provide tools and resources and companionship to anyone who is working on embedding equity in a quantitative project. So any sector, any part of the world. And one of the things that we do is this informal community gathering on Fridays called Talking Data Equity. And sometimes on Talking Data Equity, we have a specific kind of subject matter. We've recently done Bayesian analysis and small sample sizes, for example. And sometimes we have special guests. And today is one of the special guest days, which admittedly are some of my favorites. So we are going to welcome our special guest, and our special guest is going to share some slides on applying data equity in their world. And we ask that if you have questions and comments while our special guest is sharing her slides, that you go ahead and you put those comments and questions into the chat. And then we're going to have a live informal question and answer time period where you can either ask your questions in the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask your questions that way. All right, so that's the housekeeping. And our special guest is Taylor Anderson, who has been part of the Talking Data Equity community from the jump. So we're very thrilled that she's willing to join us. And she's a senior consultant at Public Profit, and she has training as an economist and as a statistician and a systems thinker. I will let her really introduce herself so that you can hear from her rather than me. But we are really, really excited because Taylor's one of those people that really puts her resources and her time and her energy into where her values are. She's not at all about performative equity. She's really working on actual equity in data. And so we are really, really honored to have her. And I think you're going to learn a lot. So over to you, Taylor.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Heather. Yeah, I'm really, really happy to be here. And yeah, share a little bit about myself, about Public Profit, and about some of the ways that we've really tried to evolve our evaluation practice to bring in a lot of different data equity principles from We All Count and from various other places. So I'm going to share my screen and kick us off. And yeah, so I'm Taylor. I'm a senior associate at Public Profit. I really like doing new things, trying new things. I had a coach when I was growing up say that you should try to do one thing a week that scares you. That feels a little bit high for me, but I try to do things that are a little bit, scary, new, different, and get out of my head and out of my comfort zone in my personal life. And I think that gives me a lot of confidence and creativity in my work life. And I really like numbers. I took a stats class. I was privileged enough to have an AP stats class in my high school, and really enjoyed it a lot. And I studied the effects of crowd size in women's college basketball championship outcomes, and just really enjoyed it and said, I think that I want to study math in school. So I did a little bit. I studied economics, and then I went on to graduate school where I have a degree in econometrics specifically. But the world of Wall Street and banks and big corporate life kind of wasn't really appealing to me, and it was really intimidating, actually. And so I decided to kind of figure out a different path to use some of my analysis skills, and landed in the field of evaluation, and moved out to California. I'm currently in Oakland, California on Liz Jan Ohlone lands, and working for public profit. And we are an evaluation and strategy firm, and we help mission-driven organizations measure what matters, and try to learn from data and improve their data quality collection, and systems so that they can improve the effectiveness and quality of their services. And in evaluation, with nonprofits and even philanthropies and public agencies, you really have to balance a research ideal with the practical realities of programming and evaluation in the real world, from money to time, to like public data not really being representative of the community that a program is trying to serve, or a lot of these other kind of contextual factors that make it really, really challenging to do data science work, but especially do data science work with equity at the center. So as a firm, we've really had quite an evolution of the last 15 years that the firm's been around. We've been there for about 3.5 now, of really trying to learn from the great thinkers in our space to really kind of elevate our practices and embed data equity principles, even in the smallest of ways. And so what I'm going to show is like a lot of examples. We've actually applied a lot of things from We All Count's ideas, like equity gap scores, funder mapping. We do it in a way called power mapping, and data biographies, things like this, that have really helped us do our work better, and center equity in that process, or try to do our best doing it. So I'm going to shout out some places where we've really been learning a lot from, and where I've really gotten a lot of lessons from, and sometimes even hard lessons from, that I've needed to sit with and chew on, and how am I then going to act differently based on this new perspective I just learned. So I'm going to just pause for a moment. And if any of these places or people kind of sprout ideas for other suggestions you would make, feel free to throw them in the chat. I'm sure that someone on Heather's team will collect them all for the forum. And learning never stops, especially when you are in the world of data. And so there's many, many more people and places that didn't fit on 2 slides, that I continue to learn from. And yeah, I think it's important to remember kind of where those pieces come from, because they might be totally new to you all, or they might be completely well known. And then when you all share other places, it then helps me build my toolkit and my exposure from different perspectives. So I'm all about resource sharing. And I think that's a great piece about the We All Count forum as well. Okay. To sum up, our approach to data equity is to take action, no matter how small, making a choice that you think is going to reduce harm or lift more voices, or result in a more equitable outcome. Take that action. It might be wrong, but if you are then also reflective, you can learn about maybe why that choice or why that decision or why that action didn't work in the way that you thought it would, and you can make a different action the next time. Kind of falling into a place of, I am too scared to make a decision, I'm too scared to make a choice and make an action, is white supremacy in action. So in order to combat that, we need to take our steps to try to just in any way possible, like I said, no matter how small. You'll see some of the examples I show are actually quite small, quite simple. and then to be reflective about it. How did that work? Did we cause more harm? What did work really well? What's something we want to keep or change next time? Okay, so I've broken out, actually, I'm going to pause here for a second, broken out some of our examples into planning stages of a project, and data collection stage, analysis stage, and reporting stage. I know that there are other stages, especially in the data equity framework from We All Count. It was just easy enough for me to put it in these 4 boxes. So that's why you're going to see several slides that have planning on it. It's because there's a couple of different planning ideas I want to demonstrate. So one, and this was actually with a collaborator of ours who was named on a previous slide, Marcela Pina. And she is the principal of, it's on the slide, community-centered resources and research, I think. But she's fabulous, and we worked together on a project to help an educational equity organization in the South build their practice for how they create programs in a way that's going to limit or reduce their own biases as a team of 3 white people who had a mission of educational equity in the South. And so this is just a snapshot. This is not all of the items from this phase for some intellectual property, but to give a demonstration of kind of what was developed. And then also just to talk a little bit about like why this was an effective strategy for this organization and kind of the things that came out of it. So we broke it into 5 phases. So ideation. So in the development of the idea of this thing, this product, they functioned in professional learning cohorts. And so we wanted each individual person who was on the planning team to rate themselves or rate the team, and then have some supporting documentation or information that kind of backs up their rating. And then to come together as a team with their individual ratings and have a conversation about if they all were in agreement that they really need to do better in this area, or they feel like they've adequately addressed this area so they can move forward. So really not as equity is not a checkbox sort of thing, but as an activity and as a reflection tool for the team to use, so that while they were planning and implementing and then writing, assessing, and communicating out about a program, in this case, a professional learning cohort, that they kind of had this documentation about how they were moving through the process and where there were gaps. And part of what we were talking with them about was that gaps happen. They happen because of time and resources. Sometimes they happen because we don't know what we don't know. They happen for far worse reasons also. And if we have a process of at least acknowledging, naming, and documenting those gaps, we can do a whole lot better next time if we've had a conversation about what we missed, why we missed it, and how do we change that for next time. So again, take action, be reflective. So you'll see that these are the 5 other sections. So the first one was ideation, design, implementation, assessment, and data and communications and publications. Again, these are not all of the items, just to give you kind of a flavor. Okay, this is actually a snapshot from an internal document at Public Profit. And this is part of our internal project kickoff. So when we get a new client, we have lots of questions that we need to answer with the client, lots of questions we need to answer internally. And then something that we've added to our practice for this internal launch is to have a conversation about what lived experiences, skill sets we have that we want to bring to the forefront in this work. what skill sets or lived experiences are we completely missing and we need to be aware of, and we need to think about how in our design stage of the project we might uplift those voices or bring those voices in. What biases do we have? What privileges are we bringing? Where are our blind spots that might hinder the way that we're going to engage with the work? And we have a list on our website that we have a list of core values and our commitment to equity. So how are we going to embody those in this work and in this design? And it's a relatively newer practice for us, but it's been incredibly helpful for us to identify as a team, to have a really open and honest conversation about where we might be shying away from because we're scared, or because we have fear, or because we don't have the knowledge and experience, that we then need to realize, okay, so then we need to figure out a way in our design process and in our analysis process to kind of find a better way that's going to embed more equity principles, like bringing those who the data is about into the meeting making process, for example. Okay. Note that there are 3 things about planning. And that's because actually it's really a really incredibly important part to making sure that you are finding all of the opportunities to embed data equity principles into your project or engagement with your client. And so the third one, but not the last strategy that we use, is power mapping. So this is same but different from the funding web that WeAllCount has on their website. Please feel free to throw a link into that. But this is actually adapted. I'm going to take a moment to grab the resource so that I can also name the person. Let me see. Here it is. Yeah, okay, so we have a process that we adapted from a guide to power mapping and analysis by Anita Tang. Let me grab it. I hope this link works because it might be outdated. And I confused myself with my windows, so I'm going to reshare.
No worries, all good, all good. We can also share all the links after. So okay. If you can't find the link in real time,
yeah, I think there's another one that I was planning to do that for, but that was too complicated. So
yeah, no worries, all good.
Great, awesome. So yeah, so and this is just like high level, you know, obviously there's a whole lot more I could say about each of these bullet points, but the intentions are similar to the funding web, and that's kind of why I named them together, is that, you know, you might have, especially in external consulting, it's very common to have 1 to 3 like direct points of contact. And they have a particular, they sit in a certain seat of power, they sit in a certain seat of decision making, they sit with their own perspective of the organization and the people that make up that organization and the programs that make up that organization, et cetera. And so the process to engage not just your key clients or your key points of contact in an engagement, but also to have representation from the various departments that your work with them might kind of touch, or even going one level out from our work is going to touch, for example, like comms and marketing, but is there another step to that we actually should also involve? And to do a collaborative process of really identifying who the different players are, and that could be individuals or teams. Identify, you know, whether they are internal to the organization or external. So are they a consumer of a product or a program? Is it the greater community? Is it some of the other organizations that are in partnership? The extent to which all of the funders are involved with this work, and get an idea of what the landscape is, because it's really, we find it really helpful to kind of uncover, like the process itself is helpful, not necessarily even the map or the outcome, but to uncover like some culture pieces about the organization that might affect data quality, for example. So there was one instance where we realized that they truly had one person who entered all grant data. And during the time of COVID, at the very beginning, when they were distributing millions of dollars, that person's plate was completely overloaded. And so then the analysis that was supposed to be using a set of variables that would truly do an equity analysis of that fund distribution were not filled out because of time. And so we didn't realize that that was going to be in play. And obviously, thank goodness, we talked about it earlier and we identified that those variables might not have good data quality, or they might be truly just incomplete. And that would have ripple effects for then what our intended evaluation question was and analysis plan was. But that only came out of kind of doing a kind of a map about who are the different people that are touching the data, and what does their environment look like? What does their resource look like? What's their capacity or competency look like? And to start to get an idea of where the information flows and where it gets halted. And that identifying those areas is obviously not just helpful for like design and implementation of a project, but also for good client management and successful engagements. And it can also really help them identify areas for organizational change. And so we really like to try to provide recommendations with our projects to organizations, so that they can improve for next time, so that it's not just about this one analysis question, but it's actually about the ecosystem that the data is living in the organization, and like who needs to be involved, whose capacity needs to be developed, who needs more resources, what are the workflows and what are their pain points in order for the information to flow more freely so that learning can actually be done and improvements can actually be made. So all of this is happening like in planning phases. And then also it doesn't end, right? Like as you keep learning, like you kind of keep returning back to these planning or reflection sort of tools and ideas, to iterate and to innovate on your projects. Oh my gosh, I have one more. I'm going to skip this one. This is like boilerplate, single page. There's a bunch of resources at the bottom that I love, and there's plenty others too that are not linked here, about the limitations of publicly available data. I'm going to name it really fast. That obviously we use it when it's useful and needed. But you can imagine with work with nonprofits or even philanthropies that are targeting a specific community or set of communities, that we have to have this conversation with them a lot, actually, about how limited the public available data is to get them the information that they're looking for to make massive funding decisions or to make massive programming decisions. And so this is kind of our boilerplate to have that conversation. Sometimes we don't show it, sometimes we use it as a back pocket, but some resources to really get that conversation started so that you can then talk about, okay, so then what would data collection look like with this community instead, that maybe will provide us more relevant and resonant information. Okay, data collection. And I realize I've been talking a lot already, so I might get a little bit zippy here. Data collection, this is our guide to creative ways to solicit feedback. It has kinesthetic, visual, and verbal methods. I can share a link later. It's on our website. But we return to this a lot not just with youth. We do this with adults. We do this with each other all the time, but these are fun, creative ways to collect information, collect feedback from communities, from groups of people, so that you kind of can limit the survey burden, but also find fun and engaging ways for people to really share their story and share their voices. So we really like to employ a lot of different methods with data collection instead of just like close-ended surveys, for example, or just interviews, because people are comfortable sharing their feedback in various styles. So we like to really kind of modulate on, okay, let's do verbal response to this one, or let's do a visual response to this question, so that we are providing options to everybody in the room, and really trying to make the space or the data collection period or time period a lot more inclusive, and actually get a whole lot more response rate and a whole lot more feedback for the analysis stages. So we find these ways not only to be effective and fun, but also to be incredibly inclusive and brings a lot more voices and color to the evaluation work. And we say a lot at Public Profit that the pathway to rigor. So I talked earlier about like needing to balance the research ideal with the practical realities of programming and evaluation in the real world. But like to get to rigor, when we're talking about evaluation in the real world, we really need to be employing culturally responsive and equitable evaluation principles. And so part of that is providing multiple modalities for people to engage. A very small piece of that, but again, another action to take. These are some hot tip pieces about focus groups and interviews, that confidentiality and consent is continuously negotiated and also critical. People might be more comfortable sharing in a group when they have shared experiences. For example, young mothers, it might be better, instead of to go after a representative sample of different kinds of mothers, you might actually make an intentional choice to put young mothers together so that they can share their story together. Location might influence how participants engage in a space. For example, if you are meeting youth at school, they might be very comfortable in their seats, raising their hand to answer a question instead of really changing it up much. And there might be cross-cultural misunderstandings. And so we find with qualitative work, it's really important to have either the people who are giving you information be part of the interpretation and meaning-making analysis process, or to have someone on the team who is facilitating these conversations that can kind of help do some of that interpretation and translation. And also like both would be ideal. Okay, data biographies. This is another piece from We All Count. And this was actually for a statewide needs assessment on early childhood care and education system. So you can imagine for a statewide needs assessment, we had a lot of different reports, white papers, needs assessments, and actual data sources that we needed to pull from. And so we developed a data biography, really rolled up into an inventory of all of the data sources. I think we ended up with like just over 100 in the worksheet. So these are the kind of the top line categories. This was organized in a Google spreadsheet. So like not that fancy. And where it was possible, we like did some validation so that we didn't just have like text everywhere that was not filterable. So what classic stuff, like what's the name, what's the link, who collected it, who published it, who's included, who's excluded, where was it collected from? For this one, it was a statewide needs assessment. So sometimes the data that was available was like of the Rocky Mountain region or of the United States. So we really wanted to have that detail in here. When was it collected? Is the data still relevant? Because a lot of times the like most recent needs assessment was from 5 to 10 years beforehand. the periodicity of the data, why was it collected, and how was it collected, and then some other things that were specific to the project. So data usage conditions is, probably relevant for all projects, source quality and reliability. But then we also had a set of guiding questions for the needs assessment. Not just like a set, it was huge. I think there were 30 individual questions for the needs assessment that was intended to answer. So we decided to crosswalk the questions to the data sources so that we could at least filter on that and then look at the subset of resources that would be relevant to answering that question for the report writing stage. Okay, analysis. This is our other bread and butter guide from Public Profit. It's called Dabbling in the Data. Again, really fun, engaging ways to engage teams with your data. And when I say teams, I mean, the program administrators or developers, and also participants. So you can imagine that the people that you might be doing some of these activities with could take a lot of different forms. And one thing to keep in mind with that is the power dynamics. So if you're going to have the program facilitators in the same room as the people who are consuming the program, for example, like youth and counselor, camper and counselor, that's something to keep in mind, either to make an intentional decision to split those groups or make an intentional decision about the activities you're doing. So we have and we actually can do these in person or we can do these virtually. Same thing goes with the other solicit feedback one. But yeah, again, really engaging ways to make meaning from data as a team. So we really try to bring this into all of our projects. And to give you an example of what it actually might look like is that we might have let's keep it simple. We might have a bunch of responses to a predominantly close-ended survey. And the report writing is to tell us the results of the survey. Well, we might be able to segment that data by race ethnicity. We might be able to segment that data by grade level. We might be able to segment that data by county, if that was part of the survey. Different things. And as an analyst, we might do everything and all of it, right? But that's not really going to be all that useful, especially for a smaller team. And so we really want teams to use the analysis, use the data, use the information, instead of just sit with the stack of descriptive stats tables that they don't end up doing anything with. And so these sorts of activities help look at a classic descriptive stats table, and engage as a team to start making meaning of, okay, well, why are we seeing a gap here? Oh, look at this, there's a big change over time. Oh, that's because we got a big CDE grant, California Department of Ed grant. And that really start to add color and flavor to what the data is showing, so that when we are writing the report, we're really telling the story, one, that the client wants to tell, that the program needs to tell, but then also that it actually resonates with the kind of information that they were looking for and hoping for from the survey process. And these are super fun. And again, we do them even among our team. We probably do Magic Quadrant at least once a quarter on something internal. Okay. Equity gap scores. Again, another We All Count special. And we've used this on a few projects now. And it's basically to indicate substantial differences in positive agreement among respondent groups, or I guess in any agreement. In this case, we're using positive agreement against different respondent groups. So you do it by dividing the largest proportion of agreement by the lowest proportion of agreement for a particular item. So I'll show you some examples. And we also, this was literally in the report, an explanation of what the equity gap score was. And then I'll show you an example of how one of them kind of tells you how to read the chart. which I really appreciate from some of my colleagues. Oops. So this is an example of, this is the, in italics in the underneath the item in the table is the percent who responded, for example, to the first item, excellent, very good, or good. And these are the different housing types: family, senior, supportive, or mixed. And so the 74 is the highest agreement response rate for the in general, would you say your health is category. And 51 in senior housing type is the lowest. Average is over in that second to last column on the right. And then the equity gap score, again, is the proportion between the highest rated and the lowest rated. And so this item here, we have a little bit of like narrative description about, but this item here at the top is the one that we actually have the highest equity gap score from. And the gap is between different housing types. So respondents who were coming from different housing types. Now, this is for a housing development organization. And so this was actually super valuable to them because they wanted to know about social determinants of health within their different housing communities and how that might be different based on the different resources and actually environmental setups, constructions of those sites. And then also in that report, we have a bunch of appendices, and we, to simplify things, we just have the percents to some other questions here that weren't of high value. Those were the ones that were included in the main report. And then the ones in the appendices were some of these other things. And my former colleague, Sherilyn, had a fabulous idea to like include a reading disaggregated statistics. Sounds like 20% of respondents who live in senior housing said they wanted to learn more about diabetes. And we found this sort of strategy to, wherever possible, provide a like how to read this chart or how to make sense from this chart really effective. And whether that's happening in the meaning making phase or whether that's happening in the actual final report kind of depends on the audience of the report and the intended uses of it. But we found it to be really effective in order for people to actually absorb what they're looking at and make some decisions and choices from it. Okay, this is like basic, right? But like we should do it. Write about your data sources and the limitations. It might be like a little bit scary to do that in a report, but it's really incredibly important. And the other thing, this is from that same statewide needs assessment. The other thing that was super valuable about this product, I mean, this was pages and pages long, was that then they had a resource for when they did it 3 years from now. So even if we weren't the same team hired, we helped provide resources to them so that they could refer back to, okay, what were the sources? They got the inventory that I showed before, and they got this resource to say, okay, these were the ones that they ended up using, and this is how they used it, and then these are the limitations of using it, so that we could not necessarily replicate, right? But at least get them on their way for when they had to redo a needs assessment 3 years later, potentially on far less funding or far shorter timeline because it was like an addendum. And then data challenges, right? Like write about them. Data is not always perfect. It's actually like probably never perfect. And so it's really important to say what was available, what was of low quality, all those things. We know this, but I actually don't see it nearly as much as I would like to. And then something else that we also do is on reporting is that we have a blurb, whether it's in the methods at the beginning or in the limitation section, we actually write about us, the evaluation team, and what biases we might have. So I'm going to highlight this one sentence down here. The team is comprised of white women currently living in California. During interviews, some staff and or grantees may have been more willing to share with us since we were external to the foundation. Others may have been less willing to share honestly with us because of our visible identities such as race, gender, or age. Regardless, the interview and survey feedback was filtered through our own interpretive lens, which are a function of our lived experiences. We took several steps to mitigate these limitations, including explicit bias checks, multiple internal meeting-making sessions, having at least 2 staff present at each interview, which takes a resource hit, and secondary checks on the interpretation of open-ended survey responses. So again, take an action, even if it's a paragraph, because it matters, and be reflective about, okay, could this have gone differently if I was different, right? Could this have gone differently if I had a second person on these interviews, or employed a different analysis process that maybe would have mitigated bias? Anyway, again, take action, be reflective. Some more resources linked, you'll get them. So yeah, I leave you with, what action will you take today? No matter how small, it matters. So do it.
Yay. Thank you so much. I love the wrap up there. What action are you going to take today? It's that's the really important part. Like, We All Count and Talking Data Equity is always about, discussing the concepts, and the potential for data equity is great, but taking a swing at embedding data equity is better. And thank you, Taylor, for sharing so many practical examples, and so many transparent examples of what you're doing. One of the things I really loved was the sounds like. I've seen a lot of different people kind of add wayfinding or interpretation to a chart or a table, but I've never heard sounds like. And I have to say, I think it's my new favorite. Sounds like is just really gets right to the point. Loved that example. There are many, many questions in the chat. And so this is the time that we will take questions in the chat. And if you're in the room and you want to unmute yourself and ask your question out loud to Taylor, we absolutely welcome that. We ask that you raise your hand, because as you can see, there's a couple hundred of you. So if everybody starts unmuting, we're going to have chaos. So if you're in the room and you want to ask a question, I would love for you to raise your hand, and we'll get you to unmute kind of as close to the order as possible. But while we wait for somebody to unmute, I'm going to read some of the questions from the chat. Oh, and if you have a question, you can either put it in the chat so everybody can see it, or if you feel shy or you don't want your name associated with it, direct message the question to me and I'm going to amplify it. So that's what I'm going to do now. Somebody said, oh, the chat's going so fast. I would love to hear Taylor's tips for navigating any pushback you might encounter from senior leadership, specifically around being transparent about data limitations in public reporting. Important question. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think it does depend on like how public are we talking, right? Like an organization can post a public report, but really only people who are like one step away from that organization end up ever downloading it and looking at it. So with that aside, I think it's taking the angle of that rigorous data work includes a conversation about limitations and quality. And that data limitations on quality is not something to hide behind. It is something to say, and this is an area we hope to improve for next year, so we can paint a fuller, more context-heavy, community-centered description of what's going on in our program. So acknowledging that it is a scary thing to do and connect with them, sometimes even one-on-one. Like I've had to have one-on-one meetings with people to work through some of that fear. And saying that this doesn't mean that this isn't good, important work. Doesn't mean that this isn't good, important results and analysis. What it means is that in order for us to give the full context of how this data was collected and who it maybe doesn't represent, and the decisions that we're making from it even though it might not be fully representative, has these caveats, and that in order to do rigorous data work, we need to name those things and then name it also as a place for improvement for the following year. We've had good success when this is a nonprofit organization for them to actually garner more funding in the next year to improve those data quality issues when it is named in the report.
I'm so glad you ended on that point, because I have really found that to really often be the point that is effective in helping encourage people to be really honest about what are the biases that are embedded in this data. I think collectively we've kind of been trained under this myth that like there is a way to collect an objective, unbiased data set. And of course, there is not a way to collect an unbiased, objective data set. Every piece of data about a human is going to have bias, and good science, good evaluation is going to be about finding ways to transparently document those biases. And so I'm so glad you ended on that thing. Somebody, Stephanie, go ahead.
Hi, just jumping off of that question. I'm just wonder about when you're dealing internally and you notice a way of gathering data and then you try and explain it to someone else who doesn't have maybe a research background, and to say, how do you navigate those conversations to say, well, you know, the way that you're asking this might create a bias, or it might not give you the information that you want?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm very privileged to come from a team of 14 fabulous women and non-binary folk who love data and love talking about that stuff. So I think when there is a lack of clarity around how or why the way certain questions are asked influence the way that they are then answered, is really complex and hard to explain. I think a possible approach that could be helpful is to kind of get to brass tacks in a sense and say, if it's asked this way, this is what the result would look like. Like, this is not the back end, like I don't mean back end in like a very technical way, but like truly, if we were to export dummy data from the Google form or from SurveyMonkey, this is what it would look like. And these are the kinds of numbers we would get. And those kinds of numbers actually won't answer our question. Or it's only going to answer a piece of our question, and we need to follow up with qualitative methods or, you know, something else. So it sounds like a more maybe complicated route, but I actually wonder if saying, like, if we went with this question, these response options, and this was the result, like, this is the kind of table we could make from it, and that doesn't feel sufficient to me. Can we add another question, or can we rework this one to really get the data that we need? Maybe that's helpful.
Yeah, I think that's really a really practical approach, because figuring out, I agree very much, like figuring out how to generate equitable evidence is going to have to include people without research backgrounds. And it's also, in my experience, often very hard to include people with extensive research backgrounds because of the preconditioning that they sometimes come with. I think that's a great suggestion.
Sometimes my like greatest fear is a PhD statistician on a philanthropic team. Oh, I'm like, that's my people, and yet.
Yeah, I hear you. And I know there are some here with us today who know the feeling. Rebecca, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been really great. I was wondering if you could talk or speak to a time when whether it's in a conversation with a client or a partner, or that you have come up against having your own biases or privileges or approach challenged in a way that has caused you to reevaluate the approach or change a tool? And I ask because I often feel like I'm practicing data equity from a fairly comfortable place. Like, I love data equity and I love practicing these principles. And then sometimes I wonder if the conversations in the groups that I'm practicing it with are still too comfortable and not challenging my own privileges enough. And so I'm wondering if you have an example of a time when you've come up against that.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so we did an evaluation on some COVID funding, and it was incredibly mixed methods, and a little bit hard to kind of wrangle it all together into one story. But we did a set of like 15 interviews. I think actually maybe 20 if we also include the staff ones, but predominantly grantees. And we had, because of the number and the time frame, we needed to kind of split who was doing which ones out. And we had a process for writing a summary afterwards. And of course we had the recording, for those who said that was okay. And, but when we kind of went, the three of us, the three interviewers and analysts got together and started to try to weave some meaning together, pull out some threads and themes, we found that we really felt like there was some pieces we were kind of just leaving. Like, these grantees shared some information with us, not because we asked about that specifically, but because it was there, and they said it and they felt comfortable to do so. And in our like kind of classic summary to the evaluation questions process, really ended up like leaving some meaty, juicy content that was about race equity. And so we needed to figure out a way to talk with the client that even though we didn't ask about these issues, they came up in multiple different ways. And there was quite a bit of pushback about including it into the report because it wasn't one of the intended evaluation questions. And so when we did we ended up getting there in a very great positive way. It did take a lot of time. We ended up putting it into a lens of polarities. So thinking about how when actions are made at either end of an extreme, there's a community hurt or burdened and left out. And so a lot of times decision-making in crises or in fast moments have to happen very quickly without consideration of what that spectrum could be. And they tend to happen on either extreme. And so we truly actually had our client write a section of the report about that tension, those tensions, and how some of this race equity feedback that we got kind of uncovered that for us. But something that we talked about in the debrief as an internal team was that we actually took a process of not coding the interviews. So we did summary reports, which were very helpful, but we wondered whether if we had done a coding process, even light touch, if we had done a coding process, that we would have more quickly realized we had content we were not lifting up and making room for. And so we are continuing to have that conversation in a firm because qualitative software is expensive. And if we're already doing these other qualitative analysis processes like memo writing and summary writing and theming as a collaborative group, then how to also add in within the timeframe and resource budget of doing some more finite and structured coding is still a conversation. But we do think that we've left room for bias there, and we left room for, I think it was good that we caught it and we were honest with each other that we needed to not let this sit. But I think if we were maybe even just a touch more rushed, we would have.
That is a fantastic answer to a really fantastic question. There's been so much response to that question in the chat that I think maybe we should make that a focus on one of our upcoming Talking Data Equities as the whole hour. Fantastic question. Taylor, thank you so much for, again, really being willing to share transparently the unembellished, real great work that you and your team are doing. And we're going to leave it here, but the last thing I'm going to say is one of the times that I've really learned how my own level of comfort was kind of accidentally embedding racism into analysis was definitely highlighted to me by next week's guest. Next week, we have a return guest. We have Dr. AJ. And if we were here in the fall, you will remember for sure, Dr. AJ Atkin-Jackson is one of the leading thinkers on how to get racism out of epidemiology. And they are graciously coming back because we did not get through even half the questions people had for AJ. And she has adopted us as part of her family. So she's going to be back next week, same time, same Zoom link. And one of the things is that if you want to submit questions in advance for next week, you can do that on our on the Talking Data Equity homepage, which is right here. You can always submit questions and speaker recommendations at that page, but specifically for next week, if you have questions on racism and epidemiology or racism and quantitative evidence in general, like I said, we didn't even get through half of them last time. So put your questions in. And I was saying to Taylor that before we hopped on here, this is absolutely my very favorite part of every week. The fact that there are so many people across the world, we have many countries represented every Friday and many more watching the videos, who really are trying to move past performative equity in our data projects and figure out how to actually do the work. And the only way we're going to figure that out is by honestly coming together and sharing strengths, sharing challenges, sharing techniques that work, sharing techniques that don't work, looking at the pros and cons. And that is what you are all doing. So it just means the world to us. Let us know how this can be more helpful. We exist to try and be helpful to you. Let us know what you need, and we will try and work it out. So have a fabulous rest of your day. We will put the video up as soon as possible, and see you next Friday. Bye, everybody.
Thanks so much, everyone.